The courtroom felt unnervingly cold, much colder than I'd expected for the situation I found myself in. Barely a moment had passed after the judge's gavel hit the block, and already my wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, was leaning back in her chair, a smug smirk playing across her lips, as if she had already won. She crossed her legs with exaggerated poise, her expensive red-bottomed heels clicking lightly against the polished wood floor. "Your Honor," she cooed, dragging a perfectly manicured nail slowly down her cheek. "Let's be honest here, my husband," she sneered, her gaze locking with mine, full of disdain, "is like a workhorse, reliable, predictable, and so incredibly easy to control." The room buzzed with murmurs, a few shocked gasps, and even a muffled chuckle from her lawyer. The judge hardly flinched before his gavel silenced the crowd. I clenched my teeth, refusing to let her see any reaction. Not yet. She was playing a part, and I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose my cool. Of course, the divorce had been her decision. After 8 years of marriage, she'd decided I was no longer enough, no longer thrilling, no longer the man she thought she deserved. But instead of leaving quietly, she had dragged me here, eager to humiliate me one last time. She'd already taken the house, the one I had built with my own hands. She fought relentlessly for half of my business, despite never lifting a finger to help with it. And now, here, in this final hearing, she was twisting the knife even further. Her new boyfriend was sitting at the back of the room, watching with a detached look, completely unveiled. A polished corporate lawyer, self-assured, the kind of man she had convinced herself was everything she wanted. She hadn't even bothered to hide it. I had caught them months ago in our bed, tangled up in the sheets I had bought, but I wasn't going to break. What she didn't know was that this courtroom wasn't the final chapter. It was just the prologue. Her lawyer, a smug man in an expensive suit, stood up and adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, my client simply wishes to address her concerns regarding Mr. Miller's ability to provide alimony long-term. She made significant lifestyle sacrifices during their marriage and deserves fair compensation for those years." Sacrifices? That was rich. Judge Wilson peered over his glasses at me. "Mr. Miller, do you have a response?" I inhaled deeply, gripping the edge of the table in front of me. This was the moment. Slowly, deliberately, I reached up and unbuttoned my dress shirt. The room fell silent. Even the judge tilted his head, clearly intrigued by my actions. I didn't hurry. I wanted every second to last. Slowly, methodically, I undid each button, then shrugged the shirt off completely. That's when the gasps started. Even my wife's smirk faded away. The look on her boyfriend's face shifted from amusement to something else, unease. Because standing there in the cold air of the courtroom, I was unrecognizable from the man my wife had been mocking. The last time she had truly looked at me, I had been soft, complacent. A man who had spent too many years working, providing, sacrificing, but not taking care of myself. I had been easy to overlook, easy to cheat on. But the man standing before them now was different, broad, powerful, completely transformed. I had spent months preparing for this moment, hours at the gym, training relentlessly, pushing my body until pain became familiar. The weight I had once carried in stress and exhaustion had been replaced with lean, disciplined muscle. Scars lined my torso, the kind you don't get from an easy life. And most importantly, across my chest, I had gotten a tattoo. The ink was still fresh, the color settling, but the message was bold and deliberate. A workhorse, breaking free from its chains. The symbolism hit everyone, especially my wife. She stared at me, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly ajar. Her lawyer recovered first. "Your Honor, I fail to see how this is relevant." I cut him off. My voice was calm, steady, but as cold as ice. "You want to talk about sacrifices?" I turned to the judge. "For 8 years, I gave everything to this marriage. I worked overtime so she could quit her job and find herself. I paid for her shopping sprees, her lavish vacations, her cosmetic procedures. I even put her name on my business, thinking we were a team." I turned my gaze back to my wife, watching as the color drained from her face. "And how did she repay me?" I gestured toward the man in the back row. "With him." A few murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Her lawyer tried to interject, but Judge Wilson raised his hand. "Let him speak." I nodded in appreciation and continued. "You called me a workhorse, huh?" My lips curled into a slow, deliberate smirk. "That's funny, because this workhorse is about to run right over you." Her expression shifted. Panic flickered in her eyes. I reached down and grabbed a thick manila envelope from my chair. It hit the table with a loud, sharp thud. "Inside this file," I said, my voice ringing clear, "are documents proving you've been committing financial fraud, hiding money, claiming expenses from my business that had nothing to do with you. Her mouth opened, then shut, and then opened again. Because of that, I continued, I'm not just withdrawing your alimony request. I'm filing a lawsuit for damages. The room erupted into whispers. Her lawyer scrambled to flip through his notes while she sat in stunned silence. The confident facade she had spent months perfecting began to crack. For the first time in what felt like forever, I saw something new in her eyes. Not arrogance. Not the smug amusement she had worn before, but fear. And this wasn't even the climax yet. This was only the start. The weight of my words lingered heavily in the air. My soon-to-be ex-wife sat frozen, her nails digging into the polished wood of the table, her carefully crafted mask of superiority beginning to disintegrate. The dismissive smirk she had worn moments ago had been replaced by something far more satisfying: panic. Her lawyer, no longer smirking, rifled through his papers, clearly caught off guard by the storm I had just unleashed. Your Honor, he stammered, adjusting his tie, I'd like to request a brief recess so we can review these. Judge Wilson raised his hand, silencing him. Not yet. The judge's sharp gaze turned to me. Mr. Miller, you're claiming to have evidence that Mrs. Miller committed financial fraud? I nodded, keeping my composure, though I could feel the pounding of my heart in my chest. Yes, Your Honor. I have concrete proof. With that, I opened the manila envelope, revealing page after page of bank transfers, falsified expense reports, and concealed credit card statements, all under my wife's name. It had taken months to gather this evidence. When I first discovered her betrayal, I wasn't just angry. I was focused. I knew I couldn't walk away from this marriage empty-handed, not after all she had done. So I did what she never thought I was capable of. I outsmarted her. I hired a forensic accountant, an expert in uncovering financial deceit. Done. And what they found was staggering. She had been quietly draining our joint accounts, covering her tracks by labeling them as business expenses. Vacations with her boyfriend, filed as client networking. Thousands spent on designer clothes, marked as a professional wardrobe. She even took a down payment for an apartment in her name, where I guess she intended to start her new life after bleeding me dry. And the best part? She had signed off on every single transaction. Judge Wilson flipped through the documents, his face unreadable, but I could see his eyes narrow slightly. Judge Wilson finally spoke, glancing over his glasses. Mrs. Miller, do you have any explanation for these? I directed my gaze at my wife, locking eyes with her, giving her the full force of my calm, steady stare. She had always been good at pretending, good at fabricating stories, but now she was scrambling. This is absurd, she blurted out, a shaky laugh escaping her lips. Clearly, he's just making things up. I cut her off smoothly. I would never, Your Honor. You'll find her signature on each and every one of these fraudulent transactions. With that, I reached for another document and slid it across the table. Here's an email where she instructs the accountant to shift funds from our business account into her personal slush fund. I watched as the color drained from her face. This moment had been a long time coming. You hacked my email? She whispered, her voice barely audible. No, I answered, calm as ever. I simply gained access to all business communications tied to my company, the very company you tried to steal from. Judge Wilson exhaled sharply, his patience running thin. Mrs. Miller, these are serious accusations, he said. Your lawyer will have a chance to respond, but for now I believe I should review these financial claims before deciding on alimony. Her lawyer, now clearly rattled, began flipping through his briefcase, desperately searching for a way out. But there was no escape, not this time. For the first time in our entire marriage, she had no control over the situation, and I wasn't finished yet. It was time to drag her new boyfriend into the mix. I shifted slightly, turning my head to look at him. The corporate lawyer, who had been sitting smugly in the back, clearly enjoying my humiliation just minutes ago, but not anymore. His face had gone rigid, his fingers tapping nervously against his leg. I caught his eyes and smiled, a slow, deliberate smile. Time to bring him into this. Your Honor, I said, standing up, I have one more piece of evidence to present before we proceed. Judge Wilson motioned for me to continue. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. This contains recorded conversations between Mrs. Miller and Mr. Johnson, I said, pointing toward her boyfriend, whose face had gone pale. In these conversations, they discussed their plan to drain me financially before she officially filed for divorce. My wife whipped her head toward me so quickly I thought she might injure herself. What? She screeched. That's illegal. He can't record private conversations. I turned to the judge. Your Honor, all of these recordings were made in my own home, in a state where one-party consent is fully legal, I stated confidently. Judge Wilson raised an eyebrow, signaling the bailiff to collect the USB drive. I'll have this reviewed, he said, his tone measured. If it contains what you claim, Mr. Miller, this case just became much more than a simple divorce hearing. The color drained from her boyfriend's face. And at that moment, I knew he had no idea. He had no clue she was planning to drag him down with her. How beautiful. I turned my attention back to my wife, lowering my voice so only she could hear. You thought you were playing me? I whispered. But you were always playing yourself. Her jaw tightened, a deep clench that made her teeth grind audibly. I wasn't the workhorse anymore. I was the man who had just shattered her entire future. The fallout had begun. Judge Wilson exhaled deeply. Given the gravity of these claims, I will need time to thoroughly review all financial documents and evidence before making any decisions. Until then, all assets are to remain frozen. Her head snapped toward him, wide-eyed, as the horror of the situation sank in. Frozen? She repeated, her voice trembling. Yes, Judge Wilson replied flatly, which means you cannot access your bank accounts, business shares, or any joint assets until the case is concluded. Her hands were visibly shaking now. She turned toward her lawyer, her voice sharp. Do something, she hissed. He simply rubbed his temples, looking utterly defeated. I, on the other hand, sat back in my chair, perfectly calm, perfectly composed. I watched as the reality of her situation slowly began to take hold. She had planned to walk away from this whole thing with wealth and triumph. Instead, she had just been completely cut off. As for her boyfriend, he was already glancing at his watch, his body language screaming that he wanted to be anywhere but here. I looked at him once more, giving him a subtle smirk. He wouldn't last long. She was about to find out just how quickly men like him scatter when the money dries up. But that was her problem to face. Because, for the first time in a long, long time, I had already won. The sound of my soon-to-be ex-wife's frantic breathing filled the room. Her perfectly curated exterior was crumbling in real time. The judge's decision to freeze her assets had sent her into a tailspin. Her meticulously planned escape, her way out of this, was falling apart piece by piece, but I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Her lawyer, desperately trying to salvage something, was stammering, talking about reviewing the evidence and reassessing financial implications. I ignored him and turned my attention to the man who had helped destroy my marriage. Her boyfriend, the corporate lawyer she had replaced me with. The same man who had watched with barely contained amusement as my humiliation unfolded during the trial. Now his smug expression was gone, replaced by the look of someone who wanted to vanish. I leaned back in my chair, giving him a knowing smirk. It was time to turn up the pressure. Your Honor, I began, keeping my voice even. Before we break for recess, I'd like to make an additional request regarding the financial fraud investigation. Judge Wilson glanced over his glasses. Go ahead, Mr. Miller. I directed my gaze squarely at my wife's boyfriend. As you'll see in the submitted documents, I continued, several of the fraudulent transactions we're discussing are linked to Mr. Johnson. His head whipped toward me. What? He said, a little too quickly. I could practically see the sweat beginning to bead on his temples. Judge Wilson flipped through the documents before looking at him. Mr. Johnson, would you care to explain why your name appears in these financial records? My ex-wife spun toward him, her eyes wide with panic. She hadn't expected this. She had dragged him into her scheme, but in his greed, he hadn't been thorough enough to ask the right questions. Your Honor, I don't know what he's talking about, Johnson stammered. I chuckled lightly. Oh, you don't, I asked, tilting my head. Because, according to these records, multiple payments were made to a personal account registered under your name, including, I picked up another sheet, a rather generous consultation fee listed under legal services. Judge Wilson raised an eyebrow. Is this true, Mr. Johnson? He faltered, his mouth opening and closing as if he were gasping for air. I don't handle personal finances, he stuttered. I couldn't help but smile. That was the beauty of this trap. He couldn't deny the paper trail. He had accepted money from my wife, probably without asking any questions, assuming it was part of a typical divorce strategy. But now it looked like he was complicit in financial fraud. For a man like him, a lawyer, this could be career-ending. I saw the exact moment he realized his fate. He shot my wife a look, not one of love or devotion, but of pure betrayal. Linda, he hissed under his breath, his voice low and furious. What the hell is this? She shook her head rapidly, scrambling for a way out. Wait. No, this isn't what it looks like. I had to move money around. And I needed to. Judge Wilson sighed deeply. I'll be calling for an official forensic audit of both parties' financial records. If Mr. Johnson was involved knowingly, he will be held liable as well. Johnson shot up from his chair. This is ridiculous. I refuse to. You'll sit down, Mr. Johnson. Judge Wilson cut him off, his tone final. The judge's voice cracked like a whip. Or I will hold you in contempt. Johnson froze. His entire career was on the line now. And Linda? She finally realized what I had done to her. Her money, gone. Her assets, frozen. And now the man she thought would save her was about to turn his back on her. I leaned up back in my chair, my heartbeat steady, my hands relaxed. It was done. She had lost. The weight of it all hit her. 15 minutes later, after the judge called for a recess, I watched as my soon-to-be ex-wife clung desperately to her boyfriend's arm. Baby, listen to me, she pleaded, her voice shaking. You know I wouldn't do this to you. It's just business stuff. We can fix this. Johnson yanked his arm away. You idiot, he hissed, his voice filled with contempt. Do you have any idea what you've done? Tears welled up in her eyes as she blinked rapidly. You said we'd be together, she whispered. I said a lot of things, he interrupted, running a hand through his hair, looking sick. I didn't sign up for a federal fraud investigation. Her breath hitched. I stood up, adjusting my cufflinks, and walked past them slowly. As I passed, I leaned in just enough to whisper, Looks like you overplayed your hand, sweetheart. She turned on me, eyes blazing with fury. You think you won? She spat, voice shaking. You think this makes you a man? I smiled, a slow, measured smile, victorious. No, I said, slipping on my jacket. I think this makes me free. Then I walked away while she stood there, broken, with no money, no power, and no one left to save her. Aftermath, a taste of her own medicine. A week later, I got a text from an unknown number. I opened it. It was Linda. Linda, I made a mistake. Please, I just want to talk. We can fix this. I laughed, not a bitter laugh, not an angry laugh, a free laugh. Then, without hesitation, I deleted her message. I didn't need to respond. I had already said everything I needed to say. The moment I deleted Linda's message, something shifted inside me. For the first time in months, no, years, I felt light, unburdened, free. The woman who had once held every part of my life in her grip was nothing to me now. Just a name in a court file, a lesson in betrayal. And yet, her downfall wasn't over. Because while I'd walked away victorious, she was still facing the consequences. The aftermath was a storm for Linda. The first blow came with the financial audit. The court launched a full investigation into her fraudulent activities, and as expected, the evidence was undeniable. She had siphoned money from our business, funneled funds into hidden accounts, and engaged in outright embezzlement. It wasn't just alimony she was losing now. She was staring down potential criminal charges. Then came the breakup. I'd always known Johnson would bail out, but even I didn't expect him to cut ties so quickly. Just 3 days after the hearing, his law firm made a public statement, distancing themselves from him. His boss announced that the firm had zero tolerance for unethical behavior, and Johnson resigned before they could fire him. And Linda? She was left completely alone. No boyfriend, no money, a ruined reputation. I had expected one final, desperate attempt from her, and sure enough, it came. One evening, as I was finishing my workout at home, I heard a knock at the door. Steady, but hesitant. I briefly considered ignoring it, but then I thought, why not enjoy this? I opened the door, and there she was, Linda Miller. Once my wife, now just a shadow of the woman she used to be. She still tried to look put together, but there was something desperate in her eyes. Her makeup was too perfect, as though she was trying to cover up the misery that lingered beneath the surface. Her expensive jewelry was gone, most likely sold off to get by, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it before. Hey, she said, forcing a small, strained smile. Can we talk? I leaned out against the doorframe, crossing my arms. What is there to talk about? I asked, my voice calm and unreadable. She shifted on her feet, letting out a nervous laugh. Look, I know things got messy. I know we had our issues. I just stood there, staring at her, waiting. I miss you, she finally said. I raised an eyebrow. Do you? She swallowed hard. Yeah, we had so many good years together, and I made a mistake. I let things get out of control. I didn't answer her. I just let the silence linger between us. Linda's expression shifted, and the mask she had been wearing slipped. Her voice grew sharper. Damn it. Can't you stop being so smug for 5 seconds? I'm trying here. I chuckled. There she was, the real Linda. The same woman who had tried to tear me down in court. The one who had mocked me for being loyal, for being so easy to manipulate. Now she was here, trying to win me back. I tilted my head slightly. You don't miss me, I said plainly. You miss the life I gave you. Her lips parted as if she wanted to argue, but she didn't, because she knew I was right. I have nothing left, she admitted, her voice breaking. No money, no one to turn to. I just need a little help. Just until I get back on my feet. I almost laughed. The audacity. But I didn't give her the reaction she was hoping for. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my wallet, and handed her a single-dollar bill. She stared at it, confused. "What the hell is this?" she snapped. I smiled. "Consider it my final act of generosity." Her face turned crimson with humiliation. "You son of a—" she started, but I shut the door in her face, and that was the last time I ever saw Linda Miller.